When President Obama said, "You didn't build that," referring to how businesses succeed, what did he reveal about his approach to the economy?
You take one phrase out of what he said, and it's quite clear that he was talking about that there are lots of different things that contribute to success, including individual initiative and so forth.
Is it groups of individuals working together? Is it somehow this nebulous collective that brings about prosperity? And I would say it's groups of individuals acting in the way that they believe best.
Tonight on Arizona Week, a report card on Obama's economic performance, plus advice from these two Arizona economists.
Production of Arizona Week is made possible in parts by a grant from the Stonewall Foundation and by the members of Arizona Public Media. Thank you for your continued support. Once again, your moderator, Michael Cheha.
The Obama economic plan: keep taxes low for the middle class, but raise them for millionaires. Provide tax credits to companies creating U.S. jobs. Use end-of-war savings to rebuild the nation's transportation infrastructure. Develop domestic energy, both fossil fuels and alternatives. Last week, we asked two Arizona economists to rate Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney's economic plan. Now they give their grades to Obama. David Wells, professor of economics at Arizona State University, and Byron Schlomach, economist with the Goldwater Institute. Thanks for being with me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What's the best part, Mr. Wells, of President Obama's economic performance and his plans going forward?
Well, it's been sort of hard. If you think that President Obama, when he took office, we were in the middle of a tremendous economic downturn. It was started during the fall, was when it was noticed, and it just continued to escalate once he took office. So, I mean, I think he did. Although he's been critical now in retrospect, saying, well, the stimulus didn't suddenly recover the economy. I think the fact that the first thing that they worked on was trying to find economic stimulus to try to moderate the level of decline, and hope they were at that time more optimistic about what it would do. But in retrospect, it's obvious that the economy was sliding much deeper than they had imagined. So I think that was a very important thing. I also think, as contentious as it's been, that the Affordable Care Act, which is going to provide health care security for a number of Americans, is going to be a critical thing as it gets implemented in 2014, unless Mr. Romney is elected and he's able to figure out a way to undercut it.
Something good about President Obama's economic performance or his plans going forward, Mr. Schlomach?
Well, I don't see that he's helped a lot as far as the economic recovery goes. I think early on in his presidency, just being somewhat reassuring to the public, I think, was a positive aspect of his tenure. As far as his plan going forward goes, perhaps the best thing is his emphasis on rebuilding infrastructure where it needs it. I think it's an overemphasis, but for the most part, I think he's any potential recovery he's slowed down to a great extent with many of his policies, including, quite frankly, the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that has demonstrably slowed down business investment. Businesses don't know what they're going to be hit with. They don't know what kind of regulation they're going to have. They don't know how much costs are going to go up when they hire someone, and they're hiring part-time instead of full-time in order to avoid any possibility of, hopefully, of future costs. So that's actually been a drag on the economy.
Would you call the Affordable Care Act the worst part of his economic performance?
Yes, yes. Although there are a lot of things to choose from. The EPA's overstepping of environmental regulation, the lawsuit of the NCLB against Boeing for trying to move a plant to South Carolina. All these things have added uncertainty. They've made businesses afraid to take a step because they don't know if they're going to be either regulated or prosecuted.
Mr. Wells, something negative or bad in Mr. Obama's economic performance or plans going forward?
Well, I mean, I think they I think there are certain aspects of the stimulus that were not probably as, you're supposed to be shovel-ready projects is what they wanted, and they weren't all the kind of projects that you want, because ideally you want projects that are going to really build the efficiencies in the economy and so forth. And some of the projects probably weren't as good as you'd like them to be. And things like the Affordable Care Act, I mean, it certainly has some deficiencies in it, but it was a monumental achievement in terms of trying to get health care reform done. And I can talk more about that as the interview progresses.
Let's talk a little bit about that now famous or infamous statement of Mr. Obama's that you didn't build that. Is he right about that? Referring to businesses that got some sort of government involvement, whether it's infrastructure or something, that contributed to their business successes. Is he right about that? Is that being overblown, Mr. Schlomach?
Well, to be fair, I think it might be overblown a little bit, because I think, listening to what he was saying and thinking about the fact that he was speaking off the cuff, he was probably referencing the fact that they didn't build bridges or something like that. However, I still think it's a legitimate criticism of Obama and his overall philosophy that he overemphasizes the role that government plays in economic prosperity. Look, we're one of the most isolated states, populations in the country. Roads are absolutely critical to our getting from point A to point B. On the other hand, it's arguable of whether or not we've implemented roads correctly. Eisenhower, for example, it was suggested to him that the interstates all be toll roads, for example. I happen to think that would have been the right policy to pursue. So whether or not we're actually being efficient in the way that we provide roads and other infrastructure is a different question. And the private sector could probably play an even bigger role than they do already in that area, and have superior incentives and such. And so my issue with Obama is not so much that, government has a legitimate role to play. I think both Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan have acknowledged that. But an underappreciation for the fact that people struggle, that entrepreneurs who make $200,000 and above, who he wants to tax, have struggled mightily by the time they get to that point, that overall entrepreneurs work extremely long hours, extremely hard, and on an hourly basis aren't paid all that well, even with their high taxable incomes. I think he doesn't appreciate that like he should.
Legitimate criticism of Mr. Obama for saying you didn't build that, or is he right?
It's been taken completely out of context. I mean, you take one phrase out of what he said, and it's quite clear that he was talking about that there are lots of different things that contribute to success, including individual initiative and so forth. But there are lots of parts in which government and other people in the community help people out. And so it was in a much broader context, and they've taken a snippet, which often happens in politics. We see this, unfortunately, all the time, where a little snippet's taken out of context and used to make a false accusation.
Now, go ahead.
I would just point out that Albert Brooks, who heads up the American Enterprise Institute, has written extensively on the fact that there are certain sectors of the economy who do more to help other people than other sectors of the economy, other groups in the economy. And he's demonstrated that, in fact, it's conservatives, especially religious conservatives, who give more to charity, who give more of their time, their spare time, than liberal groups. And so this is one of those things where nobody argues with the idea that it takes more, it kind of is a team effort for any individual success to occur. It's just, again, an issue on emphasis. Is it groups of individuals working together? Is it somehow this nebulous collective that brings about prosperity? And I would say it's groups of individuals acting in the way that they believe best for themselves and their neighbors.
What about Obama's statement, you didn't build that? We asked Wells and Schlomach for their takes on it and on Obama's approach to stimulating the economy. Let's go back 4 years to when the crisis was at its height and Mr. Obama was just taking office. And the federal stimulus packages actually had begun being formed under President Bush, but Obama executed them. You didn't build that, or you got bailed out by us? Was that a legitimate approach, Mr. Wells?
I think it was a legitimate approach. I mean, there were the possibilities of these huge corporations failing and the ramifications that would have had for the economy at that time. Because if when one company can't pay its bills, then another company can't pay its bills, and it starts mushrooming throughout the economy. So I think it was important. But what the public saw was that Wall Street got bailed out, and Main Street didn't, or in their houses. And one thing I should have mentioned, Obama did not do a very good job on dealing with the mortgage crisis. His initial plans were not effective. They've been gradually modifying them, and they've been gradually getting better at it. But in the meantime, people's houses have been foreclosed and so forth. And there should have been a much stronger emphasis early on Main Street, on everyday people and the issues related to underwater mortgages, because those people needed a lot better help than they got.
Your take on that, Mr. Schlomach, did the federal stimulus package save the economy?
I think it had to have helped, given everything else that was going on. However, look, one of the issues about, if you look at history and you look at financial crises and economic crises in the past, what you see is that if free markets are allowed to operate, a lot of people go bankrupt. It's sudden, you hit bottom, it's okay, it's kind of a slam, it hurts, there's a lot of pain, but then recovery starts very quickly after that, and it's steady, and it's steep, and it's fast. This has been an extraordinarily slow recovery, almost without historical precedent, the Great Depression being the only other example. And in fact, I would argue that there are a lot of lessons from the Great Depression that could have been learned from the FDR administration that weren't learned. He added a lot of uncertainty to the economy, a lot of regulation, a lot of business uncertainty. So those lessons simply went unlearned with the Obama administration. And to a certain extent, it might be true that stimulus needed to occur, that look, there needed to be an orderly way to settle all of these mortgages and everything. But because people want to eat, they make changes to their contractual relationships to get the best possible deal in bad circumstances. That entire process, which would have been free market oriented, individuals making individual deals, was short-circuited by government action and people waiting for their bailout. And it's just fundamentally a bad idea to try to run an economy that way, to have the government interfere in that way.
One of the criticisms of Mr. Obama that he's been defensive about is that he hasn't gotten anything done to stimulate the economy beyond the initial stimulus, which he also has criticized for it not working the way he said it would. But what he has said was that he's had plenty of ideas, but Congress won't pass them. Is that a legitimate point? Is there something in the Obama portfolio that would have made a difference, Mr. Wells?
Well, I mean, he's been trying to get his, what do you call his Jobs Act passed for the last year. And, I mean, that's, I don't think that was going to have a major impact on the economy because the size of it is relatively small. And it was not, he gave it to a joint session of Congress. He phrased it in ways that sort of turned a number of Republicans off. So it wasn't something that it was done more related to his reelection campaign to indicate to Americans that he was concerned about their situation. He was trying to position Republicans in a way that they weren't. But I don't think the size of it was significant. I mean, just to relate to some of the things that Byron is saying, I disagree about the role of government here. I mean, I think about, you see the film It's a Wonderful Life every Christmas, and George Bailey, and there's a run on the building and loan. There was a time in this country when there wasn't insurance for people's deposits. And the way banks work is they loan your money out. So your money's not in the bank. So if everybody wants their money out right away, the bank fails. And then everybody fails. So one of the great innovations of the Great Depression was deposit insurance. In this most recent economy, we've had some major problems. I mean, people receive loans and they weren't checked properly just whether they could ever pay for the loans. I mean, the whole process was very crooked. And so there's a role for government to come in and try to make sure that, and we've seen that in the banking industry now, that they're being very careful about who receives loans. So, but I think it's very important for government to come in and try to help people, because I don't think having people fall on their face in the middle of a depression is something that's really helpful. It really hurts. I mean, when we have higher unemployment, we have higher suicides, we have higher divorces, there's more abuse. And there are real human costs with this, and it's really important for government to help modify those down parts of it while trying to help the economy back up.
Was there something, Mr. Schlomach, in the Obama portfolio, the Jobs Act, that you can't get past, or something else that is a legitimate excuse for him not having done better with the economy?
No, I mean, it's been his policy choices that have caused the recovery to be so anemic. I have some numbers here I'll grab right quick. Phil Graham wrote an article that appeared in the Wall Street Journal today. He pointed out that twice in the nation's history, unemployment has reached 10% since World War II, 1982 and 2009. Now, there are differences between the two recessions that occurred around that time. 55 months after the beginning of the recession, so comparing to the beginning of the recession in 1982 and to the beginning of the recession that was going on in 2009, under Reagan, 55 months after the beginning of that recession, total employment had increased $7.8 million compared to the beginning of the recession, not the depths of the recession. Under Obama, we have 4 million fewer jobs. Under Reagan, real per capita GDP was up $3,000. Under Obama, it's down $803. Food stamp recipients, there were 3 million fewer during the Reagan recovery by this point, 55 months after the beginning of the recession. Under Obama, there are 20 million more. His policies are such that it's easier to get on disability now, and that's part of why the labor force has shrunk, is because of people going on disability. The problems are these policies that, quite frankly, aren't pro-growth at all. They're exactly the opposite.
Is part of the issue, though, that we have a labor surplus now because of the way the economy has transitioned, Mr. Schlomach, with so many people still coming out of the manufacturing realm when we were a make-things economy rather than a knowledge economy?
Well, I would argue that part of the reason our manufacturing has suffered so much is because of our tax policies. And that's not just a federal issue, it's also at the local level. And if anything, might even be worse at the local level. We sales tax in ways that services don't get impacted. We property tax in ways that services don't get impacted. To a great extent, we have exactly the economy we've been designing with our tax system. So I would argue that that's a major source of the issue, as not just technological change, but the Obama administration is actually bragging that manufacturing employment is up compared to when he took office, and that's true. That was at the very depths of the recession, but compared to the recovery in the past, obviously employment hasn't recovered nearly as quickly.
I think there are clear distinctions. I mentioned it last week between what happened in the 1980s and what happened now. I mean, this is a financial-based recession, and in the 1980s was very different. I say the private debt level relative to GDP was about 120% of GDP in 1980. It was close to 300% at this point, and it was about household debt was 50% of GDP at the beginning of the Reagan administration, and it was 100% of GDP at the beginning of this particular recession. So the debt levels are very different. And so as a consequence, I mean, this was a financial crisis, and which was very different from the 1980s. And we ended up having, Reagan ran a large budget deficit that was able to spur the economy with very good timing, and he was able to win his re-election quite handily in 1984.
Wells and Schlomach discussed Obama's plan to raise taxes on millionaires and keep them low for the rest of us. Let's talk about just one aspect of the Obama tax plans. You mentioned taxes a few minutes ago, and that is the millionaire's tax. He wants to keep the Bush tax cuts except as they affect high earners. Is that a good idea?
Well, it's politically a good idea because it sells well politically. We do need to raise revenues. I mean, we actually had a balanced budget when George W. Bush took office, and one of the first things he put in place with the support of the Republicans and Democrats was these tax cuts, which they had to put a 10-year horizon on because they had to use the reconciliation to get enough votes in the Senate at the time to get it passed. And now we've been sort of extending it, but we really need to revisit it. But politically, what sells easily is to just focus in on high-income folks. But we do need to have a more comprehensive look at our whole tax structure. Whether we have the time to do that, whether Congress is willing to do that or not, I don't know. But so I have mixed emotions about just focusing on high-income earners.
The income tax remaining at 35 or even going to 39, as I think Obama is proposing for high earners, people earning $1 million and more. Does that depress job creation?
Well, I think it does. In fact, under current law, taxes are supposed to go up in January, and we'll have one of the highest corporate taxes in the world, one of the highest capital gains taxes in the world. There are many countries, in fact, that have no capital gains tax at all. We'll be increasing the tax on dividends, which are double taxed, once on a corporation, then again on the people who get the dividends. They'll be going up, that rate will be going up 200%. This issue of so-called progressivity and regressivity of a tax system, in my opinion, is largely a non-issue. A tax system should be designed to do the least amount of economic damage possible. There have to be taxes. I'm not an anarchist, but this entire thing about whether or not the rich pay their share or the poor pay their share and all that kind of thing is largely, in my opinion, a distraction. It's just an issue made out of whole cloth. Under the first President Bush, a tax was passed on luxuries. What eventually, and that was all meant to force rich people to pay more for diamonds and furs and private planes and yachts and that sort of thing. What they found out was that they lost more to unemployment insurance and other benefits to the people who lost their jobs in those industries than they ever gained in tax revenue trying to tax rich people. The point is that taxes are so complex and their effects on the economy as a whole are so complex that we really don't know who ultimately bears the burden of them all. The issue is whether or not your tax is economically damaging. And this whole thing about rich, poor, and all that, I think is kind of silly, and quite frankly, again, it comes back to entrepreneurs who make these relatively high incomes, many of them struggling mightily for years and years to get to where they are. And now the rug is, we're trying to pull the rug out from under them and take those rewards away. What does that do to people's incentive to invest and take these risks? It's bad. It hurts the economy as a whole. It hurts people at all levels of income.
One of the discussions in the political realm is the widening income gap between rich and everyone else. I don't want to say rich and poor, but rich and everyone else. The 1%ers, the 99%ers. Is there an economic issue with there being that kind of a gap, Mr. Wells?
I think it's something that we've seen in this recovery too, because in a traditional recovery, you have a labor and a capital share that's somewhat balanced. It varies, meaning that workers get some share of the growth, and a lot of it goes into profits. Well, one of the things we've noticed in this particular recovery is Wall Street started going way up and things, and Main Street and workers have been really suffering. About 90% of the gains, it was estimated, I haven't looked at the most recent numbers, but a few months ago, was going to capital, which means that corporations were doing pretty well in the recovery, but everyday workers were still struggling a lot. And this continues something that's been historically happening basically since the 80s. Even during the 2000s part, your median family income was not growing the way the rest of the economy was. So this is an important thing. It's an important thing mostly to make sure that people who are working hard in this economy are able to plan for the future and expect that their children are going to do at least as well as they can, as well as they have done. And I think that's what's really at stake now. There's a real question mark, and there has been for some time, about whether or not that's going to happen.
Is there an economic cause or effect from the income gap that's been politicized?
Well, the gap in and of itself isn't the problem. The issue is whether or not people in general feel like they're getting made better off over time. And there's some evidence that people at the bottom haven't been getting a whole lot better off over time. In some ways, their standard of living has been improving because of the technologies that they get to enjoy, but in other ways not. What you find is that a lot of the real wage increases that people could have been getting over the last couple of decades have gone to health care.
As we did last time, I want to ask each of you, it's January 2013. Mr. Obama has been reelected. You have 1 minute with him. As an economist, Mr. Wells, what do you say to him?
Well, I think one of the things that, his administration hasn't dealt with properly yet has been is dealing with the home mortgage situation. And I think that's something that they need to monitor to see. I mean, they have made improvements relative to trying to help refinance homes, but I think they need to look more carefully to make sure that all the Americans, because many places, especially in Arizona, Nevada, and Florida, there are lots of homeowners who are well under water in their mortgage. If they've got kids going to college and they've got other things in their lives, this is something that's going to weigh them down and weigh the economic prosperity of the country down. So they need to really look carefully at what some of the options are, and including Mr. Romney's advisor, Glenn Hubbard, has a program on ways in which the government could work with the private sector to possibly refinance mortgages. So they need to look to see if there are more that they should be doing to try to make sure that's more effective.
So you would advise Mr. Obama to listen to a Romney guy?
Possibly, yes.
Mr. Schlomach, what would your 1 minute advice to the newly reelected president be?
Remember that spot in Bambi where the mother of Thumper gets onto him and he says, what does your father tell you? Well, if you can't say something nice, don't say nothing at all. I'd say if you can't do something good for businesses, don't do nothing at all. The bottom line is stop creating a world where people are constantly wondering what new hammer is going to drop on their head, whether it's the EPA, healthcare insurance, or a lawsuit by the NLRB. All of these things are helping to hamstring the economy and slowing the recovery.
Our full interview with Schlomach and Wells is on our website, azweek.com. There, too, you'll find last week's interview with these two economists about Mitt Romney's economic plans. That's our program for Friday, September 7th, 2012. For Arizona Week, I'm Michael Chihak.
Production of Arizona Week is made possible in parts by a grant from the Stonewall Foundation and by the members of Arizona Public Media. Thank you for your continued support.